I know that you have a big interest in the book. I mean, you know the book extremely well. In fact, you have it all autographed and a copy of it or something there.
Yeah,
right?
How should I put this? My personal copy of it is rather delicate. But just so you know, I'm not making this up.
Oh, wow.
Here is a photo. You can look at this later if you wish to ooh and ah it. But it's my edition was autographed by both Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward.
Well, will you talk a little bit about the transition from the book to the film and what you see as the differences that exist there in the transitioning, in the interpretation?
Sure. Now, keep in mind that it's been a few years since I've read the book, but obviously I didn't buy it so that it could sit on my shelf. The one thing that you got to remember is the book was published before Nixon resigned. There were still a few months. And also, the way the movie simplifies things. Woodward did not simply meet with Deep Throat in the garage. Sometimes Mark Felt, who turned out to be, he was the number 2 at the FBI. Sometimes they'd meet at a bar, or sometimes Woodward really needed something immediately and didn't have time for their sort of elaborate setup. So sometimes he would call, and if Deep Throat / Mark Felt simply heard Woodward sighing, he would know that Woodward wanted to have something confirmed. That's the main difference, and there were a few extra details.
So I have a question because it's been a long time since I've read the book. Do you feel that the movie had a more suspenseful feel to it than the book, or that the book was more suspenseful? Do you think that suspense, which to me is just amazing for this story, the way this was created by this filmmaker, the suspense with all of these details and all of these characters that he had to deal with, do you think that it was the same in the book, that the book laid the foundation for that, or that's strictly a film attribute?
That, I think, comes from the film. Now, the book is highly readable. Of the two of them, Bernstein was the stronger writer, as you can see in that one scene earlier. I'd have to say with a lot of my peers, I used to work at the Department of Defense. I'm a tech writer by day. And basically, journalists, unfortunately, or sometimes fortunately, depending on how good they are, don't get paid much. So basically, a lot of us get gigs in other places. My day job is writing or editing installation instructions for braking systems on trains. But when I was doing a similar job for the Department of Defense, I worked with a guy from the Joplin Globe. And he, a lot of us would cite this almost like it was scripture. We would go over different things, and when we would see a story in the news that didn't quite pan out, we were going, oh, they should have used the Washington Post rule. Because what was unique about both the book and the movie's fairly faithful. It's unusually close. For a Hollywood movie, it's fairly close to what happened. I've recently done an article on Barry Seal. There was a movie, he was a drug smuggler, and there was a movie that came out about him. I can tell you that the one thing the movie got right is there was a man named Barry Seal. Now, it's cruddy history, but it's first-rate entertainment. In this case, what I think is kind of a blessing is you get both. And you were talking about suspense. I like to call this a nail-biting movie about boredom. Because one of the things that you see in this movie is the fact that you have these guys doing what looks like incredibly unexciting things, but you know it's going to lead to something. And much of that has to do with, I would say, the sound. Remember in the parking garage where all of a sudden you can hear the brakes screech and stuff like that? The sound for this movie won an Oscar. And it also followed a rule that David Lean, the director of Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago, set up. He said that the best way to shock an audience is to get them just to the point of utter boredom, and then reveal the shock. And there's a lot of that in here, and it's really, Mr. Pakula uses this very effectively. Notice how long that opening shot of a white piece of paper is. That shot lasts for a seeming eternity. All of a sudden you're just, thump. Oh, okay. So all of a sudden you're awake and you're ready to go. But what's fascinating about this movie is it has a lot of implied danger. Now, one thing that would differ, I've read another book that Woodward wrote since All the President's Men called The Secret Man, which he wrote after Mark Felt, who was the second in command at the FBI, had revealed that he was Deep Throat. So the book deals more with how, shall we say, dicey it was. Now the funny thing is the movie gets it more right than I've seen in some other depictions, because if you'll notice with Hal Holbrook, you're never quite sure if he's on the level.
And I think this is a good place to ask audience members, with all of this rich detail and everything, and really understanding why they were so suspicious, or why, like, what's going on. I've always wondered, like, how did they get from this break-in to this big case, this big crime? But I think what the movie does very well is the movie's not really about Watergate. It's about kind of the why curiosity kills the cat, right? And it makes it very suspenseful. The thriller, it is the chasing the breadcrumbs, you know, having that ticking clock, adding those sorts of things. I did not read the book, but in watching the movie, even though the details of the case itself were kind of like, okay, who's creep? Oh, they mean that, you know what I mean? I was still riveted to those plot points. So the rhythm of the movie itself and where they put the catalyst and all the great storytelling techniques, it was all there. So do you think that is the script and the story, or the actors, or just a combination of both? I think they did everything. Of course they had, I mean, I saw Jason Robards. I hadn't seen him on screen for so long, and I was like, oh my God, I miss him. Like, I grew up watching him, and just the cast, and Robert Redford, and Dustin Hoffman, and all these great performances with such weight and seriousness. And then I liked, like he said, Carl Bernstein was the better writer. He was more kind of fastidious and going about his way. And then Woodward, he always remembered that human touch. When he was speaking, they were speaking with Sloane, he said, oh, you had your baby, you know, congratulations. And he kind of always remembered that. And so I think that they did very well in the characterization, because I don't know if that's how these guys really were, but the dynamics between the characters, and then the excitement. I was excited when they were in kind of that reporting pit where they were pitching their idea, and it's like, who's on record, who's the source, you know, that kind of thing. I feel like the energy of the movie, whether it held true to the facts or not, is kind of what propelled it forward.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really fascinating, and you can kind of see this, is they kind of nailed the dynamic that Woodward and Bernstein had in real life. While they were roughly the same age, they were both getting out of relationships, and they were both, as one of the characters says, full of an instinct for the jugular. The two men could not have been more different. Carl Bernstein was everything Richard Nixon hated. He was an atheist, he was raised a red diaper or communist baby, and he was a Jew. Bob Woodward, as you heard in the movie, was a WASP from Wheaton, Illinois. No, he was not from Wichita. I know some of us wish he was, but no, he's from Wheaton, Illinois. So they had pretty different sensibilities, and that's what I think that helps kind of drive this, because you see the dynamic, but it kind of complemented each other. Because Woodward would sometimes pause and go, oh, wait a second, do we have enough of the data? Bernstein was more of a, shall we say, a bottom line thinker. He was somebody who was better able to take raw data and make the grand conclusion. Now, one other thing is, if you have trouble getting down all the names and stuff, now, Lonita and I have talked about this a lot. She and I are friends, and she has been my friend longer than has been good for her mental health.
Stop it.
But I'm 10 years older. I was a 5-year-old when the break-in happened. And my father was a current affairs teacher. So for me, Watergate was very much a part of my life, even though I was a child. I would see my dad watching the TV when news about the cover-up would happen. It's funny, I couldn't make heads or tails of it, but I knew something was bothering my parents. As a 5-year-old, we were asked to write letters to President Nixon in either my kindergarten or my first grade class. And so as a very little boy, I thought President Nixon was really cool. As a 10-year-old, I thought he was evil. Now, one more thing that, but I guess I knew so much more when I became 10. But one thing that's really important is the screenwriter was definitely a huge factor. This was written by William Goldman, who's kind of legendary in screenwriting. Some of the other movies he's written have been Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and he also wrote both the novel and the script for The Princess Bride. Goldman, in an essay I read by him in Premiere, said that the reason he thought this works is, okay, so you don't get down all the names. It's a David and Goliath story. In real life and in the movie, Woodward and Bernstein were both around 30. You know, as they said in the movie, Woodward had only been on the Post staff for 9 months, and he was also, this isn't in the movie, he was the lowest paid writer on the paper. Since he had come from a non-union paper before he got officially hired by the Post, he wasn't eligible for some of the benefits that Bernstein would have had. So basically, you really do have a David here.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying, when we're talking about Goldman, I used to use his book in script writing classes because he is a constructivist. He very methodically tells students how to construct a detailed script. I mean, he has an incredible technique, builder mentality that he uses, a full theory, philosophy, and building technique to construct a script. Could this story, with current practices in journalism, which means computers versus typewriters and cell phones versus dial phones, could this story be as effective on screen today, do you think?
My answer is hell yes. Look at Spotlight. Many of my peers have cited it and All the President's Men with roughly equal weight. With Spotlight, you actually have characters discovering this thing called a spreadsheet. But by putting data from church directories in a spreadsheet, our reporters are able to find out which priests have been juggled around. But I do think that you see more dramas like this on cable and streaming now. Like, for example, one of the best thing I've seen all year, it hasn't played in movies, but I think is Chernobyl. It is so bloody good. And sadly, I think it's shot and acted well enough for the big screen, but it's not there. Tony, you have a question.
Well, it's also